because they're capitalists.
But it's the left that stood up for the universities as a humane critique of social priorities. It's the left that has tried to keep those traditions alive, as against the cynicism of neo-capitalism.
Let's assume that there's some truth in what you say. I have to say, I do have a conception that universities have legitimate things that they should be doing, one of it which is imparting culture. And there are other things which they do now more and more which they shouldn't be doing, like teaching people business studies and other technological forms of education. And that is entirely true. It's entirely true. That comes about because of the influence of the surrounding economic order. I don't doubt that. But the question is still what is taught in those areas where only a university can do it, like the imparting of high culture.
Yeah.
There is where that's what I was really referring to. Yeah. That is where I have felt that my vision has been radically marginalized and the subject matter confiscated. I think it's important to say this and also to emphasize that your reference to tradition is absolutely right. But tradition isn't just about changing the guard and Scottish country dancing and the sort of things that Hobsbawm mocks. It's about things like the unbroken development of the common law down 1,000 years, or the rise of the Western orchestra, the history of tonality from plain song to Wagner, etc. These are huge things which have shaped us as the things that we are.
We're in danger of agreeing too much.
I know.
You didn't come along to see some,
This is what happens when I talk. People will say to me, I'm in danger of agreeing with you.
But I do think, you see, the area of agreement is very interesting, isn't it? Because you just said, Roger, I know that you believe this, that you also feel very uncomfortable about the preeminence of business schools and managerialism within, and you have a traditional, as it were, humanistic, conservative conception of universities, with which that jars just as much as it jars with me. There is a certain sense in which a certain kind of rightist, like you, not any old rightist, links arms in that respect with a certain kind of unreconstructed old leftist, not 1,000 years from me. I didn't like Margaret Thatcher, and neither did you.
Oh, compared with all the alternatives, I did.
Sorry?
She was,
Well, you dismissed her as a market liberal, which is true. She didn't see her as a true Tory.
No, that's true.
Yeah,
but
I've
grown up since then.
But she hasn't. But I think given that kind of given that there's a long tradition of a certain kind of conservatism and a certain kind of leftism, both hitting, as it were, a mainstream bourgeois, capitalist, whatever you like to call it, establishment. The question that then arises for me is this, right? And this for me is a fundamental question in addressing people of your position. Given that you have that sort of distaste for those activities, given that you equally have a distaste for the coarsening and cheapening of cultural life, you nevertheless remain firmly committed to the very economic and political system which, in my view, is largely responsible for that cheapening and diluting and sensationalizing and vulgarizing of culture. That's what I really don't understand.
Well, that's a very good point to make, and I would respond in the following way, that this cheapening and commodification of culture that you rightly criticize is to be observed everywhere, and was to be observed just as much in the so-called socialist states that prevailed in Eastern Europe in my youth and in your youth. It doesn't seem to have been resisted in anywhere by any political action, partly because I think it isn't in itself simply the result of any political decision. It's something that has come about entirely because of prosperity, because of the ways in which people can make easily available the cheaper forms of entertainment without there being any authority to criticize them. And in your view, I mean, if you were in charge, I suspect it would be a bit more you would go back a little bit more towards the Catholic Inquisition about all this, actually examining cultural products and saying, you know, which should we allow
That's
to
right. Everybody
exist.
would have to read Brecht 3 times a day.
Yes, that sort of thing. But
Roger, as you know, I'm no defender of the cultural policies of the Soviet Union. I've spent most of my life fighting for Stalinism.
But the problem is, what is the alternative?
Well,
we agree that there's a problem.
Well, I don't think we agree on the definition of the problem. I spent most of my life fighting Stalinism in political terms and also in cultural ones, but I don't agree that the problems of culture under Stalinism are anything like the problems of culture under market society. They're no better. They may well be worse. You know, if you have an authoritarian state telling artists what to write, otherwise they're carted away to prison. Sure, that's actually worse than, you know, the dumbing down of culture under late capitalism. All I'm saying is one has to diagnose 2 different conditions here. And the condition, and what I don't understand about your position, is that the specific forms of vulgarization of culture which exist under capitalism you rightly deplore, and you support the very framework which generates them.
I'm not known for advocating economic theories. I suspect that I would support whatever is necessary by way of economic activity for there to be universities in the first place. But I would agree with your position that universities should be, especially in the humanities, critical vis-à-vis the surrounding order. That is the function of culture. And I think you said that this has ceased to be in some way, but I think that it's ceased to be largely because people in universities and in schools have neglected that function of culture, that it should inject into the ordinary way of thinking those critical ideas which enable people to distance themselves from the obvious temptations of economic life.
But I think the distancing is part of the problem there. The way culture and the humanities were actually set up historically, the way if you like, the origin, the modern origin of the humanities or of culture, was in that necessary distancing from themselves from an increasingly industrial society, so that values which were really dysfunctional in that society were increasingly, as it were, expelled and had to be preserved somewhere else. You had to have an enclave which actually preserved these values. You call it the arts or the humanities or university or culture, it doesn't matter. The problem, however, and I think this is, you see that side of it, Roger, and you applaud it, and so do I, but I see another side too. That distance is also crippling. That distance, which is necessary, as it were, to preserve those values in some utopian or residual way, also means it's impossible to bring them actively to bear on social life.
But how would you close the distance without the apparatus of censorship?
You and I both were at the same college in Cambridge and knew each other and knew Raymond Williams, who was my mentor, if you like. Now, when Williams talks about the culture and society tradition, he is indeed talking about figures who want to preserve certain kinds of value from the depredations of industrial capitalism, all the way from almost Burke to Lawrence. But he's also talking, not least in the case of people like William Morris and to some extent Wilde, about people, the point where that tradition becomes, as it were, sees that the only way forward is to try to link these values to a political movement. Now, that's where, of course, you will pull back, because a typically conservative view is that culture is one thing and politics is another. If that is the case, I'm afraid there's no way of bringing these values to bear on everyday social practices. That's my problem with this position.
Well, if you think that, then you still have to say what kind of political order would enable these conservative, cultural values to permeate once again the everyday life of ordinary people. And all attempts to make this happen have come a cropper for some of the reasons that you say. Identity politics ends by vulgarizing culture and making it impossible for it to assume a critical stance.
One reason I've said this before, forgive me if you heard it, one reason why I'm a Marxist, quite apart from just enjoying annoying people, is that I don't like to do any work. I don't really like working. Marx's answer to the question you're posing, Roger, surely, is that one of the reasons why people's lives are cultureless or filled with a phony or bogus kind of culture is because, we extraordinarily, at this late point in human history, have to invest as much energy in labour, or in making profit because of the nature of our system, that there are simply no energies left. Marx is all about leisure and culture and not about labour, but he thinks that we have to change the system which absorbs so much of our energies there if we're to free those energies. And that's a very respectable kind of William Morris, Oscar Wilde, Marx, they all believe in that.
Yes,
now, that's not a program. That's not a program, I agree. But
I would hesitate to accept that because it seems to me that the degradation of our culture, that which at least we would agree is degraded, has come about through increase in leisure. Look at television. It's a leisure industry. It's a leisure product for everybody. It's what they go and sit down in front of it, and it has just declined consistently since the beginning, partly because it doesn't have to make any effort. And look at the decline in popular music from folk music of the 19th century down to today. The folk music of the 19th century, which inspired all the great composers of the early 20th century, was produced by people who really were working very hard. They didn't have any leisure, but they did put their heart and their soul into their singing.
But Roger, again, unfortunately, one point where I think left and right can agree is that, unfortunately for this meeting, is that what's important for a whole Marxist or socialist tradition about art is that it has no immediate, obvious, utilitarian function. Yes? It doesn't get you anywhere.
Yes, it wasn't Marx who first said that, of course. No.
It wasn't, no, indeed it wasn't, but Marx was a closet Aristotelian, and he there's certain connections there. Marx loved art and literature and culture exactly because, just by virtue of the kinds of useless things they were, gloriously pointless things they were, they formed a kind of living refutation or critique of a society in which everything is dominated by exchange value, instrumental rationality, and so on. The difference between, I'm sure much of that you would accept, Roger, you too.
Definitely.
But the difference is that Marx raises that. He says, how do we then bring about a society in which it would be possible, in which human energies, as far as possible, could be expressed as ends in themselves and not be instrumentalized. You may not agree with his answer. My point is, you have to raise the political question for that vision to become viable.